Before we begin, let us know where you're listening from. After the story, rate it from 1 to 10. Now let's start. The Montana winter had a way of turning familiar landscapes into alien terrain. Jaycee Hammond knew this better than most, having grown up on the eastern plains where blizzards could transform rolling grasslands into blinding white wastelands within hours. What she hadn't counted on was how quickly the weather could change when she decided to make the 3-hour drive from her small veterinary practice in Silverdale to check on a rancher's sick horse. "Just a quick trip," she'd told her assistant. "I'll be back before the storm hits." The forecast had predicted the blizzard would roll in after midnight. Plenty of time to examine Mr. Whitaker's prize quarter horse and return home. But forecasts in Montana were about as reliable as promises made by her ex-fiancé, which was precisely why Jaycee found herself white-knuckling the steering wheel of her Ford F-150 as visibility dropped to near zero. The truck's tires lost traction on a curve, and despite her careful corrections, the vehicle slid gracefully off the rural highway and into a snowbank. The engine sputtered and died. "Perfect," she muttered, pulling her phone from her pocket. "No service." Another Montana reality she should have anticipated. Jaycee assessed her situation with the same clinical detachment she used when examining a difficult case. She had warm clothes, a blanket in the back seat, and enough gas to run the heater intermittently. The rational choice was to stay put and wait for help or improved conditions. But rationality warred with the knowledge that no one knew exactly where she was, and the temperature was dropping fast. Mr. Whitaker's ranch was just over the next ridge, maybe 2 miles away. A difficult walk in a blizzard, but not impossible. She zipped her heavy coat to her chin, pulled on her gloves and hat, wrapped the blanket around her shoulders, and stepped out into the howling wind. Jackson Hayes had spent the afternoon securing the barn and outbuildings at the Whitaker Ranch. As the foreman, he took his responsibilities seriously, especially when Hank Whitaker was away at his daughters in Billings. The older rancher had left that morning, before the forecasters had moved up the timeline on the approaching storm. "Doctor should have been here by now," he murmured to Cisco, the ailing quarter horse. The animal nickered softly in response, his eyes dull with fever. Jackson checked his watch again. The vet was over an hour late, and with the storm worsening, he doubted she'd make it at all. He'd just decided to call and tell her not to attempt the drive when he heard Ben, his cattle dog, barking frantically at the front door of the ranch house. Jackson frowned. Ben wasn't a barker unless there was good reason. When he opened the door, the dog shot past him into the swirling snow. "Ben, get back here," Jackson called, but the dog disappeared into the white curtain. Cursing under his breath, Jackson grabbed his heavy sheepskin coat and hat. He stepped onto the porch just as Ben's barking grew more insistent. Squinting against the driving snow, Jackson caught a glimpse of movement, a dark figure trudging slowly through knee-deep drifts, following the dog. He was down the steps and plowing through the snow before conscious thought caught up to instinct. As he drew closer, he could make out a small form, hunched against the wind, stumbling forward with determined steps. "Hey," he called, his voice nearly lost in the howl of the wind. "This way." The figure looked up, and Jackson saw a woman's face, pale with cold, her eyes red-rimmed from the wind. Recognition flickered in those eyes, though he was certain they'd never met. "You must be the vet," he said, reaching her side. "Dr. Hammond?" She nodded, her teeth chattering too much for speech. Without hesitation, Jackson swept her into his arms. She was slight but solid, and she stiffened in surprise. "I can walk," she protested weakly. "Save your strength," he replied, already turning back toward the house. "Hypothermia is setting in. How long were you out there?" "An hour? Maybe more." "My truck." She trailed off, shivering violently. "We'll worry about your truck later." By the time they reached the porch, she'd stopped shivering. Not a good sign. Jackson carried her directly to the living room where a fire burned in the hearth. He set her gently on the couch and began unwrapping the frozen blanket from her shoulders. "Need to get these wet clothes off you," he said matter-of-factly. "I'll get you something dry to wear." Her eyes, a striking hazel color he now noticed, met his with a flash of wariness. "I'm fine." "You're not," he countered. "But you will be. I promise I'll be a gentleman. Document. I'm just trying to keep you alive." A faint smile touched her blue-tinged lips. "My patients usually have 4 legs. Consider me your assistant then." He helped her remove her coat and boots, then fetched a set of Hank's late wife's clothes from the guest room. These might be big, but they're warm and dry. I'll make some coffee while you change. In the kitchen, Jackson put the kettle on and tried to push away the worry that had settled in his chest. The woman had nearly died out there. If Ben hadn't heard her approaching, he shook his head, unwilling to follow that thought to its conclusion. When he returned with a steaming mug, she was dressed in the flannel shirt and sweatpants he'd provided, her wet clothes folded neatly beside her. The color was returning to her cheeks, and she'd wrapped herself in the quilt from the back of the couch. "Thank you," she said, accepting the coffee. "I'm Jaycee, by the way. Jaycee Hammond. Jackson Hayes. Friends call me Jack." He settled into the armchair opposite her. "Want to tell me what possessed you to walk through a blizzard, Dr. Hammond?" She took a sip of coffee before answering. "I was supposed to check on a sick horse. My truck went off the road about 2 miles back. I thought I could make it on foot." She glanced toward the window where snow continued to fall in heavy sheets. "Not my brightest moment. The horse can wait until morning." "Is he feverish? Lethargic?" "Off his feed." Professional concern overrode her exhaustion. Jackson nodded. "All of the above. But he's stable for now. I should take a look at him." She started to rise but swayed on her feet. Jackson was beside her in an instant, steadying her with a hand on her elbow. "Tomorrow," he said firmly. "You're in no condition to treat anyone tonight." Their eyes met, and something shifted in the space between them, a recognition, perhaps, of kindred spirits. Both stubborn, both dedicated to their responsibilities. After a moment, she nodded and sank back onto the couch. "Tomorrow," she agreed. Jaycee woke to the smell of coffee and bacon. For a disorienting moment, she couldn't remember where she was. Then the events of the previous night came flooding back. The blizzard, the walk through the snow, the strong arms that had carried her to safety. She sat up on the couch where she'd spent the night, wincing at the stiffness in her muscles. Sunlight streamed through the windows, reflecting blindingly off the snow-covered landscape outside. The storm had passed, leaving behind a pristine white world. Morning. She turned to find Jackson Hayes watching her from the kitchen doorway, a dish towel slung over his shoulder. In the clear light of day, she took proper stock of him for the first time. Tall and broad-shouldered, with dark hair that curled slightly where it met the collar of his flannel shirt. His face was tanned and weathered from outdoor work, with laugh lines around eyes that were a startling shade of blue. "How are you feeling?" he asked, crossing to hand her a mug of coffee. "Like I was hit by a truck, but I'll live." She accepted the coffee gratefully. "Thanks to you and your dog." Jackson shrugged off her gratitude. "Ben's the real hero. He heard you before I did." As if summoned by his name, the blue heeler trotted into the room and sat at Jaycee's feet, looking up expectantly. "Hello, Savior," she said, reaching down to scratch behind his ears. The dog leaned into her touch, his tail sweeping the floor. "He likes you," Jackson observed. "He's usually standoffish with strangers. Animals can sense when someone understands them." She sipped her coffee, then set it aside. "I should check on my patient." After breakfast, Jackson insisted. "Doctor's orders." She raised an eyebrow. "You're a doctor now?" A smile tugged at the corner of his mouth. "No, ma'am. Just following the advice of a wise woman who once told me never to work on an empty stomach." "Your mother?" "My grandmother." He gestured toward the kitchen. "Eggs are almost ready." Over breakfast, Jaycee learned that Jackson had been the foreman at the Whitaker Ranch for 5 years. Before that, he'd worked ranches all over Montana and Wyoming, never staying in one place too long. "What changed?" she asked, curious about what had made him settle. He considered the question. "Hank Whitaker, I guess. He treats his people like family. Made me feel like I belonged here." He glanced out the window at the snow-covered hills. "Plus, there's something about this land. Gets under your skin." Jaycee understood that feeling. She'd moved to Montana after veterinary school, drawn by the wide-open spaces and the self-reliant spirit of the people. What was supposed to be a 2-year stint at a rural practice had turned into 8 years in her own clinic. "What about you?" Jackson asked. "What brought you out to these parts?" "I wanted to work with large animals, not just pets. And I was tired of city life." She didn't mention that she'd also been running from a relationship gone sour, a fiancé who'd wanted her to give up her career ambitions for his. After breakfast, they bundled up and made their way to the barn. The cold was bitter but manageable in the bright sunshine. Cisco the quarter horse was indeed ill, an upper respiratory infection that required antibiotics. I've got some in my truck, Jaycee said after completing her examination, along with my other supplies. Jackson nodded. I'll get the tractor and pull your truck out. The county plow should have cleared the main road by now. It took most of the morning to retrieve her truck. By the time they returned to the ranch, administered medication to Cisco, and checked on the other animals, it was past noon. The winter sun was already beginning its early descent. You should probably stay another night, Jackson said as they stamped snow from their boots on the porch. Roads will be icy after sunset. Jaycee hesitated. She had appointments scheduled for the following morning, but she could call her assistant to reschedule. And the thought of driving on treacherous roads after dark held little appeal. If you're sure it's not an imposition. It's not, he said simply. Besides, you should check on Cisco in the morning anyway. That evening, they cooked dinner together, moving around the kitchen with an easy coordination that surprised Jaycee. Jackson was more talkative than she'd initially thought, sharing stories about life on the ranch and listening intently to her tales of veterinary school mishaps. So there I was, she said, laughing, covered head to toe in mud, holding this enormous pig that had escaped during my large animal practical exam. Jackson's laughter joined hers, a rich, warm sound that seemed to fill the room. What did your professor say? He said, Dr. Hammond, while your restraint technique is unorthodox, it appears to be effective. She smiled at the memory. I got an A. After dinner, they settled in the living room with cups of hot chocolate. The fire crackled in the hearth, casting a golden glow over the room. Ben lay stretched out on the rug between them, occasionally sighing contentedly in his sleep. Can I ask you something personal? Jackson said after a comfortable silence had stretched between them. Jaycee tensed slightly, but nodded. What made you walk through that blizzard? The real reason. She stared into her mug, gathering her thoughts. I guess I was trying to prove something to myself. That I could handle whatever came my way. That I didn't need. She trailed off. Need what? Anyone else. She met his gaze directly. My ex used to say I was too independent for my own good. That someday it would get me in trouble. Jackson considered this. Being independent isn't the same as being foolhardy. No, she agreed. But sometimes I forget where the line is. She set her mug down. What about you? Any exes giving you grief about your character flaws? A shadow crossed his face. Just one that mattered. She wanted more than ranch life. More than I could give her. I'm sorry. He shrugged. It was years ago, but it taught me something important. What's that? That loving someone means accepting who they are, not who you want them to be. Their eyes met across the space between them, and Jaycee felt something shift in her chest. A recognition of a kindred spirit, someone who understood what it meant to hold your ground even when it cost you. 3 days later, Jaycee found herself driving back to the Whitaker Ranch. Cisco had responded well to treatment, but she wanted to check his progress one more time. At least, that's what she told herself as she navigated the now clear roads. Jackson met her at the barn, his face lighting up when he saw her truck pull in. Doc. He greeted her, the nickname somehow warmer than when they'd first met. How's our patient? She asked, retrieving her medical bag from the passenger seat. Breathing easier. Back to his ornery self. She followed him into the barn, where Cisco nickered in greeting. The examination confirmed what Jackson had reported. The horse was well on his way to recovery. You've got a good touch with him, she observed as Jackson stroked the horse's neck. Most people wouldn't notice the subtle signs you picked up on. I pay attention, he said simply, then added with a small smile, to things that matter. The way he looked at her made her wonder if he was still talking about the horse. Over the next few weeks, Jaycee found reasons to visit the Whitaker Ranch. A follow-up check on Cisco. A vaccination day for the whole herd. Dental exams for the older horses. Jackson was always there, ready with a cup of coffee and that quiet, steady presence that had begun to feel like a necessary part of her day. They fell into conversations as easily as breathing. He told her about growing up on a small farm in Idaho, about losing his parents young and being raised by his grandmother. She shared stories of her childhood in eastern Montana, her struggle through veterinary school, and her determination to build a practice serving the ranching community. One evening in late February, after she'd stayed for dinner, they sat on the porch despite the cold, wrapped in blankets and watching the stars emerge in the clear night sky. I keep waiting, Jackson said quietly. For what? For you to run out of medical reasons to visit. Her heart quickened. Would you want me to come even if there were no animals to treat? He turned to look at her, his blue eyes serious in the dim light. I think you know the answer to that, Jaycee. She did know. She'd felt it growing between them. This quiet, steady thing that didn't demand or push, but simply existed, getting stronger with each shared meal, each conversation, each moment of comfortable silence. I'm not good at this, she admitted. Letting people in. I've noticed. His voice held no judgment, only understanding. But you're better at it than you think. He reached across the space between their chairs and took her hand. His palm was warm and calloused against hers. I don't need you to be different, he said. I just need you to be here when you can. The rest we can figure out as we go. She looked at their joined hands, then up at his face, so open, so patient. It struck her then that this was what had been missing with her ex. This acceptance of her exactly as she was, independence and all. I'd like that, she said softly. Their first kiss, when it happened moments later, felt like coming home to a place she'd never been before. His lips were gentle but sure, his hand coming up to cradle her face with a tenderness that made her heart ache. Spring came to Montana in fits and starts. Warm days followed by sudden snowstorms, green grass peeking through melting drifts. Jaycee and Jackson's relationship grew like the season, cautiously at first, then with increasing confidence. He drove into town to have dinner at her small house above the veterinary clinic. She spent weekends at the ranch, helping with chores and enjoying the peaceful rhythm of country life. They discovered shared passions for horseback riding, old Western novels, and terrible science fiction movies that made them laugh until their sides hurt. What Jaycee valued most was the space he gave her. Jackson never questioned her dedication to her practice or complained when emergency calls interrupted their plans. Instead, he'd pack a thermos of coffee for her and tell her to drive safely. Sometimes, if the emergency was at a ranch he knew, he'd come along to help, his steady hands and calm demeanor a welcome presence in crisis situations. In turn, she found herself softening, opening to the possibility of a partnership that enhanced rather than restricted her life. She learned to call when she was running late, to ask for help when she needed it, to share her worries about difficult cases. On a warm evening in May, they rode to the top of a ridge overlooking the ranch. The setting sun painted the landscape in gold and amber, the distant mountains purple against the sky. They dismounted and sat side by side on a flat rock, shoulders touching. I have something to tell you, Jackson said after they'd watched the sunset in companionable silence. Jaycee turned to him, curious at the serious note in his voice. Hank's retiring, moving to Billings to be near his daughter and grandkids. Oh, she felt a flicker of alarm. Does that mean you'll be looking for a new position? He shook his head. He's offered to sell me the ranch. Said he's been planning it for years, setting aside money so I could get a loan for the rest. Jaycee's heart lifted. Jack, that's wonderful. It's perfect for you. It's a big step. A big commitment. She heard the question beneath his words. But it's what you want, isn't it? To have roots, to build something that's yours. Yes. He took her hand. But I've been thinking about what that means. About who I want to build it with. The air between them seemed to still, charged with possibility. I'm not asking for anything right now, he continued. I know you have your practice, your life in town. I'm just saying, there's room for both. For your independence, and for us. If that's something you might want someday. Jaycee looked out over the land. The rolling hills, the creek winding through the valley, the weathered barn and house in the distance. She thought about the life she'd built, the boundaries she'd drawn to protect herself after her engagement had fallen apart. Then she thought about the man beside her, who had carried her through a blizzard and then, with the same steady devotion, carried her heart into a new season. I think, she said carefully, that someday might be closer than I once thought. His smile was like sunrise, slow and warm and full of promise. We've got time. And they did. Time to work out the details, to grow together, to find the balance between her practice and his ranch, between independence and partnership. But in that moment, with his hand in hers and the Montana sky spreading endlessly above them, Jaycee knew with bone-deep certainty that she'd found what she hadn't even known she was looking for, a love as vast as the landscape around them, as steadfast as the mountains on the horizon, a love that had begun in a blizzard but would flourish through all seasons to come.